Along the banks of the Nile River for more than 3,000 years, one of humanity's most sophisticated and enduring religious systems flourished. Ancient Egyptian religion was far more than mythology and ritual. It was a complete framework for understanding existence itself, from the moment of creation to the eternal cycles of death and rebirth, from the smallest acts of daily life to the grand cosmic dramas played out among the gods. This was a belief system that saw divinity in everything, that transformed the landscape of the Nile Valley into a sacred geography, and that developed elaborate technologies of the spirit designed to ensure that both the living and the dead could navigate the complex relationship between order and chaos, light and darkness, mortality and immortality. Tonight, we explore this remarkable tradition in all its depth and complexity. Before we begin this journey, if you're finding value in these historical explorations, I'd deeply appreciate it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these in-depth historical narratives, and it lets me know that you're enjoying these journeys through time. The subscribe button and notification bell ensure you never miss our nightly stories from history. Now, imagine standing at the edge of the desert as the sun sets over the Nile. The river flows before you, its waters catching the last golden light of day, and in the distance, you can see the dark silhouettes of temple pylons rising against the deepening sky. The air is still warm from the day's heat, but a gentle breeze carries the coolness of evening, along with the scent of incense from nearby shrines. This is the Egypt of the pharaohs, a land where every element of the natural world held sacred significance, where the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms were permeable and constantly negotiated through ritual and prayer. Picture the landscape around you in this moment of transition between day and night. To the west, beyond the green fertile strip of the Nile Valley, the red desert stretches endlessly toward the horizon, its sand glowing like copper in the fading light. The Egyptians called this the Deshret, the Red Land, the realm of Set and chaos, contrasting with the Kemet, the Black Land, the fertile soil deposited by the Nile flood. Between these two realms, between order and chaos, between life and death, you stand as countless generations stood before you, watching the eternal drama of sunset unfold. The Nile itself is perhaps 500 paces wide at this point, its surface rippling gently in the evening breeze. On the far bank, you can see the shadows of palm trees, their fronds moving slowly like the hands of priests making ritual gestures. Small fishing boats are returning to shore, their nets empty or full depending on the favor of Hapi, the god of the inundation who controls the river's bounty. The fishermen call out to one another in voices that carry across the water, their language the direct descendant of the tongue spoken when the pyramids were young, though they would not recognize those ancient words now. As darkness falls more completely, the stars begin to emerge, those celestial lights that the ancient Egyptians saw not merely as distant suns but as the imperishable souls of the blessed dead, sailing across the body of the sky goddess Nut in their boats of eternity. The night sky itself was understood as a great divine being, arching over the earth, swallowing the sun each evening and giving birth to it again each dawn. Even this simple act of watching night fall would have been, for an ancient Egyptian, a participation in sacred drama, a witness to the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governed all existence. Watch as the darkness deepens as more and more stars pierce through the veil of twilight. The ancient Egyptians knew these stars intimately, had charted their movements for thousands of years, had organized them into constellations that bore little resemblance to our modern astronomical maps. They saw in the sky the celestial Nile, the river along which the gods sailed in their boats. They identified certain stars as Osiris and Isis, as Horus and Set, as the imperishable ones who never sank below the horizon and therefore had achieved the most perfect form of eternal life. The sky was not empty void but teeming with divine presence, each star a soul, each constellation a story, each movement a mythological event playing out on the grandest possible stage. The evening star appears, brilliant and unmistakable in the western sky. The Egyptians knew this star by many names, associating it sometimes with Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, sometimes with the Ba of the deceased pharaoh sailing across the heavens. Planets were recognized as special stars, wanderers who did not keep to the fixed patterns of their fellows, and they too were given divine identities. Mars was Horus of the horizon, Jupiter was Horus who illuminates the two lands, Saturn was Horus Bull of the sky. The cosmos was not an impersonal mechanism but a community of divine beings, each with agency, each with purpose, each participating in the great drama of existence. In the temples along the river, priests are beginning their evening rituals, chanting hymns in the ancient Egyptian language, burning incense and making offerings to the divine statues housed in the innermost sanctuaries. These rituals are not mere acts of devotion. In the Egyptian understanding, they are essential acts that literally sustain the cosmos, that feed the gods and maintain the delicate balance between Maat, the principle of cosmic order, truth and justice, and Isfet, the ever-present threat of chaos and dissolution. Listen, and perhaps you can hear the faint sound of those rituals, carried on the evening breeze. The rhythmic chanting of the lector priests, their voices rising and falling in patterns established thousands of years ago, reciting words from scrolls so ancient that even they do not remember when they were first written. The tinkling of sistrums, those sacred rattles associated with Hathor, shaken by priestesses to drive away evil spirits and attract divine attention. The deep resonance of drums marking the rhythm of the ceremony, each beat a heartbeat of the cosmos itself. The incense rising from the temples is not mere fragrant smoke but a sacred substance that carries prayers to the heavens, that purifies the sacred space, that pleases the nostrils of the gods. The ancient Egyptians imported frankincense and myrrh from the distant land of Punt, making dangerous expeditions by sea to obtain these precious resins. They believed that the gods loved the sweet smell of incense, that it nourished them in ways that physical food could not, that the rising smoke created a ladder between earth and sky that prayers could climb. Inside the sanctuary, the high priest stands before the god statue, his head newly shaven, his body purified through multiple washings, his linen garments spotlessly white. He speaks words of power, calling upon the god to be present in the statue, to accept the offerings, to continue the work of maintaining creation. His voice is steady and confident, but there is also a sense of awe, of approaching something tremendous and potentially dangerous. The gods are not tame. They are powerful beyond human comprehension, and calling upon them requires both courage and precise knowledge of the proper forms and formulas. This is the world we are entering tonight, a world that lasted longer than almost any other civilization in human history, a world that saw the rise and fall of 30 dynasties, that witnessed conquest and reconquest, that absorbed influences from Nubia, Libya, the Near East and eventually Greece and Rome, yet maintained a remarkable continuity of belief and practice across millennia. We will move slowly through this landscape, exploring its depths with patience and attention, allowing the details to accumulate like layers of sand, building our understanding grain by grain. To understand ancient Egyptian religion, we must begin before the beginning, in that mysterious state that preceded creation itself. The ancient Egyptians, like many cultures, pondered the fundamental question of origins. How did the ordered world come into being? What existed before existence? Their answer was none, the primordial waters, an infinite, dark, formless ocean that contained all potential but no actuality, all possibility but no realization. None was not simply water in the ordinary sense. It was the state of non-being, the absence of differentiation, a condition in which there was no up or down, no light or darkness, no life or death, because these categories had not yet been created. It was described as dark, infinite, and inert, yet paradoxically, it contained within itself the seeds of everything that would eventually come into existence. This concept reveals something profound about the Egyptian understanding of reality. They did not believe that the universe was created from nothing, but rather that it was organized from chaos, that order was imposed upon the formless, that the act of creation was fundamentally an act of differentiation and separation. Think about what this means philosophically. The Egyptians were proposing that existence itself is not the natural state of the universe but something that must be actively maintained. The default condition is not being but non-being, not order but chaos. The created world is like an island of light in an infinite ocean of darkness, constantly at risk of being submerged again if the forces of creation weaken or falter. This understanding gave urgency to ritual practice, to the maintenance of Maat, to the pharaoh's role as cosmic maintainer. Everything they did to uphold order was not merely culturally important but cosmically essential. Consider also the psychological and existential implications of this worldview. The Egyptians lived with a constant awareness of the fragility of existence, of how easily the ordered world could slip back into chaos. This was not paranoia but a realistic assessment based on their experience. They had seen periods of social breakdown, of famine and invasion, when indeed it seemed that Isfet was overwhelming Maat, that the world was dissolving back into chaos. Their mythology gave them a framework for understanding these experiences and, more importantly, for believing that order could be restored through proper action. The waters of Nun were simultaneously terrifying and generative. They represented the void, the abyss, the threat of annihilation, but also the womb from which all life emerged. Water in Egyptian culture always carried this dual meaning. The Nile flood brought life but could also bring destruction if it rose too high or failed to come at all. Water dissolved and washed away, returning things to an undifferentiated state, but it also cleansed and purified, making rebirth possible. To pass through water was to die and be reborn, whether literally in the inundation or symbolically in ritual lust ration. The primordial mound that emerged from none was perhaps the single most important image in Egyptian cosmology. Every temple claimed to be built on the site of this original mound, to be the center of creation, the place where being first emerged from non-being. This was not meant literally. The Egyptians were not so naive as to believe that each of their hundreds of temples was actually the site of creation. Rather, each temple recreated the conditions of creation, became symbolically the primordial mound, allowed the community to participate in that original creative act. In this primordial ocean, there was no dry land, no place to stand. The Egyptians, living in a land where the annual Nile flood brought both fertility and the threat of chaos, understood water as both life-giving and potentially destructive. The flood waters each year would cover the land, turning it back temporarily to a state resembling none, and when they receded, they left behind fertile black soil. This annual cycle gave the Egyptians a lived experience of creation and recreation, of the emergence of order from chaos, repeated every single year. The emergence from none was imagined in different ways by different theological schools, but certain elements remained constant. The first act of creation involved the appearance of a primordial mound, rising from the waters. This mound, called the Benben in some traditions, was the first solid ground, the first place of being in a universe of non-being. Every temple in Egypt would later claim to be built on the site of this original mound, to be the very center of creation itself, the axis mundi where heaven and earth connected. Upon this mound, the first conscious being came into existence. But how? The Egyptian texts speak of this with beautiful ambiguity. In some versions, the Creator God willed himself into being through an act of pure thought or speech. In others, the Creator emerged spontaneously from none, the waters themselves giving birth to consciousness. This Creator, often identified as Adam in the Heliopolitan tradition, or Ra in his solar aspect, or Ta in the Memphite tradition, was alone. He was the totality of existence, containing within himself all that would be. The loneliness of the Creator God is a poignant detail in many Egyptian texts. Here was a being who was everything and nothing, who existed in complete isolation, who was the only consciousness in an infinite universe of unconscious potential. This solitude needed to be broken. The act of creation then was also an act of self-division, of the one becoming many, of unity fragmenting into multiplicity so that relationship and interaction could exist. But before we explore how that creation unfolded, we should pause to consider what none represented philosophically. The Egyptians never believed that none was destroyed or eliminated by the act of creation. Rather, none continued to exist at the edges of the created world, surrounding it like an ocean surrounds an island. None was there beneath the earth, above the sky, and at the horizons. The ordered cosmos floated, as it were, in an infinite sea of chaos, always potentially vulnerable to being dissolved back into that primordial state. This meant that creation was not a single event in the distant past, but an ongoing process. The world had to be continuously maintained, continuously recreated, or it would slip back into the chaos of none. This is why ritual was so important in Egyptian religion. The daily temple ceremonies, the pharaoh's role as maintainer of Ma'at, the elaborate funerary practices, all of these were technologies designed to sustain the created order against the ever-present threat of dissolution. The nun was also the source of potential renewal. Just as the Nile flood brought destruction and then new life, none represented the possibility of regeneration. The dead were believed to pass through the nun on their journey to resurrection. The sun god Ra traveled through the waters of Nun during the night, the 12 hours of darkness, emerging renewed each dawn. None was dangerous but also necessary, the womb from which all life emerged and to which it might return for rebirth. In some texts, Nun himself is personified as a deity, depicted as a bearded man raising the solar bark, lifting the sun from the waters each morning. His consort was sometimes named Nanit, the feminine aspect of the primordial waters. Together, they represented the duality inherent in even the most primordial state of existence. Even in chaos, there was male and female, positive and negative, the fundamental polarities that would become more pronounced in the act of creation. The theological sophistication here is remarkable. The ancient Egyptians were grappling with questions that still occupy philosophers today. How does something come from nothing? What is the relationship between unity and multiplicity? Between order and chaos? Between being and non-being? Their answer, embodied in the concept of none, suggests that these apparent opposites are actually interdependent, that chaos and order, non-being and being, exist in a dynamic relationship, each defining and necessitating the other. As we contemplate none, we can almost feel ourselves floating in those dark, formless waters. There is a strange peace in this image of pre-creation, a kind of ultimate rest, a state before separation and struggle before the complexities of existence. Yet there is also an emptiness, a profound loneliness, a lack of meaning in a universe without differentiation or consciousness. The emergence from none was necessary, painful though it might be, bringing with it all the joys and sorrows of existence, but also bringing meaning, beauty, and the possibility of relationship. From the primordial waters of none, the world emerged. But how exactly? Ancient Egypt was not a monolithic culture but a collection of cities and regions, each with its own temple, its own priesthood, and its own theological traditions. Over the 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, 3 major creation myths or cosmogonies developed, each centered in a different city, each presenting a distinctive vision of how creation unfolded. These were the Heliopolitan, the Memphite, and the Hermopolitan cosmogonies, and understanding them helps us grasp the rich complexity of Egyptian theological thought. The Heliopolitan cosmogony, centered in the city of Heliopolis in Lower Egypt, was perhaps the most influential throughout Egyptian history. In this tradition, the creator god was Adam, whose name means something like the complete one or the finished one. Adam emerged from none onto the primordial mound, alone and containing within himself all potential existence. But creation required multiplicity, and so Adam engaged in an act of self-generation, producing the first pair of gods through what the text describes sometimes as sneezing, sometimes as spitting, and sometimes in more explicitly sexual terms as masturbation. This first divine pair consisted of Shu, the god of air and dryness, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. With their creation, the process of differentiation had begun. Where Adam was undifferentiated unity, Shu and Tefnut represented the first polarities, male and female, dry and wet, the fundamental divisions necessary for a functioning cosmos. These 2 deities then united and produced their own offspring, Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. But Geb and Nut were created in an embrace so tight that there was no space between earth and sky, no room for creation to flourish. Their father Shu had to intervene, separating them, holding Nut aloft while Geb remained below. This separation created the space in which life could exist, the fundamental architecture of the cosmos with sky above, earth below, and air between them. Even today in Egyptian art, you can see images of this cosmic family, Geb reclining on the ground, his body forming mountains and valleys, Nut arched over him, her body spangled with stars, and Shu standing between them, arms raised to hold the sky aloft. Geb and Nut, though separated, continued to be fertile, and they produced 4 children who would become central to Egyptian mythology: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. These 4, together with Adam, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut, formed the Ennead, the group of 9 deities who represented the primary stages of creation from primordial unity to the multiplicity of the created world. The Ennead was not just a genealogical chart but a philosophical statement about the nature of existence, each generation representing a further stage of differentiation and manifestation. But Heliopolis was not the only theological center in Egypt. Memphis, the ancient capital, developed its own sophisticated cosmogony that presented a strikingly different vision of creation. In the Memphite theology, preserved for us in a text inscribed on the Shabaka stone, the creator god was Ta, the patron deity of craftsmen and artisans. Ta's method of creation was not physical but intellectual and verbal. He conceived of creation in his heart, which the Egyptians considered the seat of thought, and then brought it into being through his tongue, through the power of the spoken word. This is a remarkably abstract and sophisticated concept. Ta thought of everything that would exist, and by naming it, by speaking it into being, he made it manifest. This theology gave primacy to consciousness and language over physical generation. It presented creation as an act of divine intellect and speech, a concept that would later resonate in other religious traditions, including the Logos theology of Christianity. The Memphite priests argued that Ta was actually prior to Adam, that Adam himself was a thought and a word of Ta, and therefore Ta was the true first cause, the ultimate creator. In the Memphite system, Ta also created the other gods through thought and speech, and he created humans and all living things the same way. The text explicitly states that everything that exists came into being through what the heart conceived and the tongue commanded. This placed enormous importance on language and ritual speech in Egyptian religion. If the world was created through divine words, then human words, properly formulated in ritual and prayer, could access and manipulate divine power. The third major cosmogony came from Hermopolis, called Kemenu in ancient Egyptian, a city in Middle Egypt. The Hermopolitan cosmogony presented a more complex vision of the pre-creation state. Instead of a single creator emerging from none, the Hermopolitan theologians posited the Ogdoad, a group of 8 primordial deities who existed in none before creation. These 8 were arranged in 4 male-female pairs, each pair representing a fundamental aspect of the pre-creation chaos. The 4 pairs were Nun and Nanit, representing the primordial waters themselves, Her and Hahe, representing infinity or endlessness, Kek and Kakit, representing darkness, and Ammonius and Amenet, representing hiddenness or the unknown. These 8 deities were not really individual beings in the normal sense but rather personifications of the qualities of the pre-creation state. They existed in none, embodying its darkness, its infinitude, its formless potential. Through the interaction of these 8 primordial forces, a cosmic egg was formed, and from this egg emerged the sun god Ra, who then proceeded to create the world. In some versions the egg was laid by a celestial goose, in others by an ibis. The emergence of Ra from the egg represented the birth of light and consciousness from darkness and chaos, the first glimmer of ordered existence in the infinite void. What's fascinating is that the Egyptians did not see these 3 cosmogonies as contradictory. A priest in Heliopolis would acknowledge the truth of the Memphite theology, and a priest in Memphis might incorporate elements of the Hermopolitan system. The Egyptians were comfortable with multiplicity in their theological explanations. They understood that the mystery of creation was profound enough to accommodate different perspectives, different emphases, different metaphors. In fact, over time these systems were often harmonized. Adam and Ra were conflated as Adam Ra, the creator sun god. Ta was sometimes identified as a form of Nun itself, the container of all potential from which creation emerged. Ammonius, one of the Hermopolitan Ogdoad, would eventually rise to become Ammonius Ra, king of the gods during the New Kingdom, combining the hidden primordial deity with the manifest solar creator. This theological flexibility reveals something important about Egyptian religion. It was not dogmatic in the way we might expect from our own religious backgrounds. There was no single orthodox account of creation that had to be believed to the exclusion of all others. Instead, there was a rich plurality of mythological and theological traditions that coexisted, overlapped, and cross-fertilized each other. The Egyptians were more interested in the accumulation of sacred knowledge than in the elimination of competing claims. Each cosmogony emphasized different aspects of the creative process. The Heliopolitan system emphasized physical generation and the genealogical unfolding of the divine family. The Memphite theology emphasized intellectual conception and the creative power of speech. The Hermopolitan cosmogony emphasized the multiplicity of forces present in chaos and the dramatic emergence of light from darkness. Together, these 3 systems gave the Egyptians a multifaceted understanding of creation that acknowledged both its physical and metaphysical dimensions. The act of creation was also understood as the establishment of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Before creation there was no order, no justice, no truth, only the undifferentiated chaos of none. Creation was the imposition of structure, the establishment of categories and boundaries, the separation of this from that, light from darkness, sky from earth, order from chaos. But this order was fragile and required constant maintenance. The sun had to rise each day, the Nile had to flood each year, the rituals had to be performed, or the world would slide back into chaos. This is why the Egyptians placed so much emphasis on ritual regularity and on the pharaoh's role as the maintainer of Ma'at. The pharaoh was not just a political ruler but a cosmic functionary whose proper performance of ritual duties literally sustained the world. When a pharaoh failed in this duty, when Ma'at was neglected, the result was isfit, chaos, which might manifest as foreign invasion, famine, drought, or social upheaval. As we reflect on these creation stories, we can see that the ancient Egyptians were engaged in a profound exploration of existence itself. They were asking the deepest questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? How did order emerge from chaos? What sustains the world we inhabit? And their answers, expressed through myth and ritual, shaped every aspect of their civilization for 3,000 years. The gods of ancient Egypt numbered in the hundreds, perhaps even thousands if we count all the local and regional deities, the personified concepts, and the various aspects and manifestations of major gods. But within this vast divine population, certain families and genealogies provided structure and coherence. The relationships between the gods were not merely familial but cosmological and political. reflecting the Egyptian understanding of how power, authority, and cosmic function were distributed across the divine realm. We have already encountered the Heliopolitan Ennead, that group of 9 deities descended from Adam. But the story did not end with the birth of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. These 4 siblings would become central to one of the most important mythological cycles in all of Egyptian religion, a cycle that touched on themes of death, resurrection, betrayal, justice, and rightful succession. Osiris was the eldest of these 4 siblings, and according to tradition he became the first king of Egypt, ruling over a golden age when he taught humans agriculture, law, and civilization. He was a benevolent ruler, and Egypt flourished under his kingship. His sister wife Isis was his devoted consort, a goddess of great magical power and wisdom. But their brother Set was jealous of Osiris's power and position. Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert, embodied the principle of Isfet, disorder, in contrast to Osiris's embodiment of Mot. The conflict between them was not just personal but cosmic, representing the eternal struggle between order and chaos, fertility and sterility, civilization and wilderness. Set plotted against Osiris, and in the most famous version of the myth, he crafted a beautiful chest exactly fitted to Osiris's measurements. At a banquet, Set offered this chest as a gift to whoever could fit inside it. When Osiris lay down in the chest, Set and his conspirators slammed the lid shut, sealed it, and threw it into the Nile. The chest, with Osiris trapped inside, floated down the Nile, out into the Mediterranean Sea, eventually washing ashore in Byblos on the Phoenician coast. There, a tamarisk tree grew around it, its trunk encompassing the chest, with Osiris's body hidden within. The tree grew to be magnificent, so large and beautiful that the king of Byblos had it cut down and made into a pillar for his palace, unknowingly incorporating the body of the god into his royal residence. The pillar was said to emit a wonderful fragrance, though no one knew why. Isis, grief-stricken, searched throughout Egypt and beyond for her husband's body. Her search was not quick or easy. She traveled from city to city, from shrine to shrine, asking everyone she met if they had seen her husband. In some versions she was helped by scorpions who protected her on her journey. In others she was guided by children who had seen the chest floating down the river. Her laments were so moving that the very stones wept with her, and the Nile itself swelled with tears of sympathy. When Isis finally learned that the chest had drifted to Byblos, she traveled there and presented herself at the royal court, disguised as a humble woman. The queen of Byblos, moved by something in Isis's bearing, took her into service as a nursemaid for the royal children. Each night, Isis would lock herself in a room with the youngest prince, and strange lights and sounds would be heard. Suspicious, the queen spied on Isis and discovered her true nature. She was a goddess, and she had been attempting to make the prince immortal by burning away his mortal elements in fire while transforming herself into a swallow and flying around the pillar that contained Osiris's body. Isis, grief-stricken, searched throughout Egypt and beyond for her husband's body. She eventually found it in Byblos in Phoenicia, where it had washed ashore and been incorporated into a tamarisk tree that had grown around it. She brought the body back to Egypt, but Set discovered it, and in a rage he tore Osiris's body into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout Egypt. Once again Isis set out on a sorrowful quest, this time searching for the scattered pieces of her husband. With the help of her sister Nephthys, Set's wife who sympathized with Isis, she found all the pieces except one, the phallus, which had been eaten by a fish. Using her powerful magic, Isis reassembled Osiris's body, creating the first mummy, and fashioned a replacement phallus from gold. Then, in an act of powerful magic, she transformed herself into a kite, a bird of prey, and hovered over the mummified body of Osiris, fanning him with her wings and breathing life back into him. But Osiris could not return to the land of the living. He had crossed the threshold of death, and that passage was irreversible. Instead, he became the king of the dead, the ruler of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and the judge before whom all the dead would appear to account for their lives. His resurrection was not a return to mortal existence but a transformation into a new mode of being, an eternal life in the realm of the dead. Before descending to the underworld, however, Osiris had, through Isis's magic, impregnated her, and she gave birth to a son, Horus. Isis hid the infant Horus in the papyrus marshes of the Nile Delta, raising him in secret, protecting him from Set's murderous intentions. When Horus came of age, he challenged Set for the throne of Egypt, claiming it as his rightful inheritance from his father Osiris. The conflict between Horus and Set became one of the central myths of Egyptian kingship. It was not simply a story but a template for understanding royal succession, legitimacy, and the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. The battle between Horus and Set was epic and multifaceted, involving shape-shifting, magical contests, trials before the gods and savage combat. In some versions, Set tears out one of Horus's eyes, while Horus castrates Set. Each injury had cosmic significance. Horus's eye became the Wedjet or Eye of Horus, a powerful protective symbol, while Set's injury represented the neutering of chaos. Eventually, the dispute was brought before the Ennead, the Council of Gods, for judgment. The gods were divided. Some supported Horus's claim based on rightful inheritance. Others supported Set, arguing that the throne should go to the stronger god. The debate went on for 80 years in mythological time, neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Finally, the gods sent a letter to Neith, the ancient creator goddess, asking for her wisdom. She replied that Horus should receive the throne as his father's rightful heir, while Set should be compensated with double dominion over the desert and storms, and should be given 2 foreign goddesses, Anat and Astarte, as wives. This judgment established the principle of legitimate succession in Egypt. Every pharaoh was considered the living Horus, the rightful heir to the throne, while Set represented the forces of chaos and foreign lands that the pharaoh had to control and subjugate. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris, the divine ancestor, and his son became the new Horus. This mythological pattern provided cosmic sanction for the institution of kingship and for the principle of hereditary succession. But the divine genealogies extended far beyond this central mythological cycle. Many gods had complex family relationships that reflected their functions and domains. Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, music, and motherhood, was sometimes identified as the daughter of Ra, sometimes as his mother, and sometimes as his consort. This apparent contradiction makes sense when we understand that these relationships were symbolic rather than literal. Hathor as Ra's mother represented the regenerative power that allowed the sun god to be reborn each dawn. As his daughter, she represented the beauty and joy that emerged from his light. As his consort, she represented the feminine principle that complemented his masculine creative power. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and magic, had a particularly interesting role in the divine genealogy. He was said to be self-created, emerging from the lips of Ra as the divine word, or hatched from the egg of the Hermopolitan cosmogony. He served as the scribe and mediator of the gods, recording their decisions and sometimes arbitrating their disputes. In the contest between Horus and Set, it was Thoth who healed Horus's damaged eye, and it was Thoth who recorded the final judgment. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the dead, had a genealogy that connected him to the Osiris myth. In most versions he was the son of Osiris and Nephthys. Set's wife Nephthys had disguised herself as Isis to seduce Osiris, and from this union Anubis was born. Fearing Set's wrath, Nephthys abandoned the infant, and he was found and raised by Isis. When Osiris was murdered, it was Anubis who performed the first mummification, preparing Osiris's body for resurrection and thus establishing the funerary practices that would become central to Egyptian religion. Regional gods also had their genealogies that connected them to the major pantheon. Khnum, the ram-headed creator god of Elephantine in the south, was said to fashion humans and their souls on his potter's wheel. He was sometimes identified as a form of Ra or as a primordial creator deity existing alongside Adam. Sobek, the crocodile god, had temples throughout Egypt but was particularly important in the Fayum region. He was variously described as the son of Neith, as a manifestation of Ra, or as a primordial deity who emerged from none. The goddess Sekhmet, depicted as a lioness or a woman with a lion's head, was one of the most fierce and powerful deities. She was the daughter of Ra, created to punish humanity when they rebelled against the sun god's rule. Ra sent Sekhmet to Earth, and she began slaughtering humans with such ferocity that Ra feared she would destroy all of humanity. To stop her, he tricked her by flooding the fields with beer dyed red to look like blood. Sekhmet drank the beer, became intoxicated, and fell asleep, forgetting her mission of destruction. When she woke, her rage had been transformed into benevolence, and she became the goddess Hathor. This myth illustrates an important feature of Egyptian theology, the mutability and interconnection of divine identities. Sekhmet and Hathor were in some sense the same goddess, representing different aspects or moods of the feminine divine power. The Egyptians called this theological principle the Eye of Ra, the feminine destructive and protective power that the sun god could send forth and recall. Another important divine family centered on Ammonius, who rose to supreme importance during the New Kingdom. Ammonius was originally one of the 8 primordial deities of the Hermopolitan Ogdoad, representing hiddenness or the unknown. But during the Middle Kingdom he became the chief god of Thebes, and when Theban rulers unified Egypt and established the new kingdom, Ammonius was elevated to king of the gods, merged with Ra as Ammonius Ra. Ammonius' family formed the Theban triad. Ammonius himself as the father, Mut as the mother goddess, and Khonsu the moon god as their son. This divine family was understood as a cosmic template for the human family, with the pharaoh and his queen understood as earthly manifestations of Ammonius and Mut. The great temple complex at Karnak was dedicated to this triad and became the largest religious structure in ancient Egypt, a testament to Ammonius' supreme power. The genealogies of the gods were not static but evolved over time. New gods were incorporated into existing family structures. Foreign deities brought through trade and conquest were assimilated by being identified with Egyptian gods or given Egyptian parents. Astarte and Anat, goddesses from Canaan, were incorporated as daughters of Ra or wives of Set. Reshep, a war god from Syria, was adopted into the pantheon and given an Egyptian genealogy. This theological flexibility allowed Egyptian religion to absorb new influences without losing its fundamental character. The divine genealogies provided a framework that could expand to accommodate new deities while maintaining the essential relationships and hierarchies that structured the cosmos. The gods were not isolated individuals but members of families, participants in networks of relationship, conflict and cooperation that mirrored and sanctioned the human social order. As we contemplate these divine families, we see that they served multiple functions. They explained the origins and relationships of cosmic forces. They provided mythological charters for social institutions like kingship and marriage. They gave narrative structure to theological concepts. And they offered the Egyptians a rich symbolic language through which to understand their world and their place in it. At the very heart of ancient Egyptian religion lay a concept so fundamental that it permeated every aspect of their civilization: Ma'at. Usually translated as truth, justice, order, or balance, Ma'at was far more than an abstract principle. It was understood as both a cosmic force that structured reality and a goddess who personified that force. Understanding Ma'at and its opposite, Isfet, is essential to grasping how the Egyptians understood their world and their responsibilities within it. Ma'at was established at the moment of creation. When the creator god emerged from none and began the process of differentiation that produced the ordered cosmos, he was establishing Ma'at, imposing structure on chaos, creating the categories and boundaries that made existence possible. The regular rising of the sun, the annual flooding of the Nile, the succession of the seasons, the movement of the stars, all of these were manifestations of Ma'at, the orderly functioning of creation according to its proper pattern. But Ma'at was not only cosmic. It had ethical and social dimensions as well. Ma'at encompassed truth-telling, justice, fair dealing, proper conduct in accordance with one's social role, respect for hierarchy, and harmonious relationships. A person who lived according to Ma'at spoke truthfully, dealt honestly, fulfilled their obligations, respected the gods and the king, and maintained proper relationships with their family and community. To live according to Ma'at was to align oneself with the fundamental order of the universe. The goddess Ma'at was depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head, or sometimes as just the feather itself. This feather would play a crucial role in the judgment of the dead, as we shall explore later. But the personification of Ma'at as a goddess meant that order and justice were not merely abstract concepts but divine presences that could be approached through ritual and prayer. The ostrich feather that symbolized Ma'at was chosen for specific reasons. Unlike other feathers, the ostrich feather is perfectly symmetrical, with veins of equal length on both sides of the central shaft. This symmetry represented balance, equality, and fairness, the essential qualities of justice. The feather was also light, suggesting that Ma'at did not burden or oppress but created conditions for flourishing. Yet it had substance and reality. It was not merely an ideal but something tangible that could be weighed against the human heart. When we examine what living according to Ma'at meant in practical terms, we find a comprehensive ethical system that touched every aspect of life. Truth-telling was fundamental. The ancient Egyptian word for lie was grg, and lying was considered one of the gravest violations of Ma'at. To speak falsely was to introduce chaos into the ordered world, to make communication unreliable, to undermine the foundations of society. Legal proceedings emphasized the oath, the solemn declaration before the gods that one was speaking truth. Perjury was not merely a legal violation but a cosmic offense. Justice in the social sense was also central to Ma'at. The powerful were expected to deal fairly with the weak, judges to decide cases without favor or bribery, officials to administer their offices honestly. The wisdom literature repeatedly emphasizes these themes. Do not be greedy in a division, advises the instruction of Tahotep, one of the oldest surviving moral texts. Do not be covetous beyond your portion. Do not be greedy toward your kin. The just man is preferred to the unjust. These were not merely pious platitudes but principles that structured social expectations and provided grounds for criticism when rulers failed to live up to them. The concept of reciprocity was embedded in Ma'at. If you were generous to others, Ma'at required that others be generous to you. If you dealt honestly, you could expect honest dealing in return. If the pharaoh protected his people and maintained justice, the people owed him loyalty and obedience. If the gods received proper worship and offerings, they were obligated to provide protection and blessings. This reciprocal understanding created what might be called a moral economy, a system of mutual obligations that bound together humans and gods, in networks of reciprocal responsibility. Every pharaoh, upon ascending to the throne, had as his fundamental duty the maintenance of Ma'at. In countless temple reliefs and texts, we see the pharaoh making an offering of Ma'at to the gods, literally presenting a small figure of the goddess or her hieroglyph. This ritual gesture symbolized the king's pledge to uphold cosmic and social order, to ensure that justice prevailed, that the proper rituals were performed, and that Egypt remained aligned with the fundamental structure of the universe. The pharaoh's role as maintainer of Ma'at connected the political and cosmic orders in profound ways. When the king ruled justly, when he protected Egypt's borders, when he ensured that the temples were maintained and the rituals performed, he was not merely governing well in a political sense. He was participating in the cosmic struggle against chaos, holding back the forces of Isfet that constantly threatened to dissolve the ordered world back into the primordial chaos of none. Isfet was everything that opposed Ma'at: chaos, disorder, injustice, falsehood, violence, and upheaval. While Ma'at was associated with the fertile Nile Valley, with civilization, with the predictable patterns of nature, Isfet was associated with the desert, with foreign lands, with unpredictability and danger. The red desert that surrounded the black fertile land of Egypt was Isfet's domain, the realm where order gave way to chaos. But Isfet was not simply evil in a moral sense. It was a necessary counterpart to Ma'at, the primordial chaos from which creation emerged and which continued to surround the created world. Isfet provided the dynamic tension necessary for existence. Without it, there would be only static order, no change, no generation, no creativity. The desert, though dangerous, was also a source of precious minerals and stones. The storm, though destructive, brought the fertilizing Nile flood. Even Set, the god most closely associated with Isfet, had a necessary role to play in the cosmic drama. Every night, as the sun god Ra journeyed through the Duat, the realm of the dead, he faced the greatest manifestation of Isfet, Apophis, also called Apep, the great serpent of chaos. Apophis was not exactly a god but an embodiment of pure chaos, the force that sought to swallow the sun and return the world to darkness and non-being. Each night, Ra's solar bark was attacked by Apophis, and each night, the sun god and his defenders had to battle the serpent to ensure that the sun would rise again. In this nightly battle, Set actually played a heroic role. Despite his association with chaos and his role as Osiris's murderer, Set was strong enough to confront Apophis, and in many versions of the myth, it was Set who stood at the prow of the solar bark and drove off the serpent with his spear. This paradox reveals the complexity of Egyptian theological thought. Set embodied Isfet within the created order, but he also defended Ma'at against the greater chaos that threatened from outside. He was dangerous and necessary, destructive and protective. The daily rising of the sun, then, was not automatic but the result of successful cosmic struggle. The sun rose because the forces of Ma'at, marshaled by Ra and his defenders, had defeated the forces of Isfet represented by Apophis. This meant that creation had to be renewed each day, that the victory of order over chaos was never final but had to be won again and again in an eternal cycle. The temples played a crucial role in this cosmic struggle. The daily temple ritual, performed in temples throughout Egypt, was understood as a participation in the maintenance of Ma'at. When priests woke the god's statue in the morning, washed it, dressed it, offered it food and incense, they were not merely honoring the deity but actively sustaining the cosmic order. The god, satisfied with proper worship, would continue to perform his or her cosmic function, whether that was making the sun rise, bringing the Nile flood, maintaining the fertility of the land, or defending against chaos. This is why the disruption of temple ritual was so serious. When temples were desecrated or neglected, when offerings were not made, when priests failed in their duties, the result was not merely religious impropriety but cosmic catastrophe. The gods, deprived of their sustenance and worship, might withdraw their protection, allowing Isfet to gain ground. The result could be drought, famine, plague, invasion, or social upheaval. On the individual level, living according to Ma'at was both an ethical obligation and a practical necessity. The Egyptian moral universe was not based primarily on divine commandment but on cosmic order. To lie, cheat, steal, or commit violence was wrong not because the gods had forbidden it but because such actions violated Ma'at, contributing to chaos and disorder. The negative confessions in the Book of the Dead, where the deceased declared before the gods all the sins they had not committed, were essentially declarations of having lived according to Ma'at. But Ma'at also had a reciprocal aspect. Just as humans were obligated to uphold Ma'at, so too were they entitled to expect Ma'at from those in authority. The pharaoh was supposed to rule justly, and texts from various periods show that Egyptians believed they had the right to expect justice from their king. Officials were supposed to deal honestly and fairly. The gods themselves were expected to uphold Ma'at, and in some texts, we see humans appealing to the gods on the basis of Ma'at, arguing that justice required divine intervention on their behalf. This created a kind of cosmic contract. Humans upheld Ma'at through proper conduct and ritual, and in return the gods maintained the order of the world and ensured human welfare. When this contract broke down, when Ma'at was violated by either humans or gods, the result was Isfet, manifesting as personal misfortune or social catastrophe. The concept of Ma'at also shaped Egyptian attitudes toward foreigners and foreign lands. Egypt itself was the land of Ma'at, the ordered and civilized center of the world. The desert and foreign countries were realms of Isfet, populated by chaotic and uncivilized peoples. This did not necessarily mean that Egyptians viewed foreigners as evil, but they were seen as outside the order, as belonging to the realm of chaos that surrounded the ordered Egyptian world. When Egypt conquered foreign territories, the ideological justification was often framed in terms of extending Ma'at into the realm of Isfet, bringing order and civilization to chaotic lands. When foreign powers conquered Egypt, it was understood as a catastrophic triumph of Isfet over Ma'at, a temporary victory of chaos that would eventually be reversed by the restoration of proper Egyptian rule. The ethical dimension of Ma'at was expressed in various wisdom texts that have survived from ancient Egypt. These texts, often framed as the advice of a wise father to his son, emphasized truthfulness, justice, moderation, discretion, and respect for hierarchy as the keys to a successful and virtuous life. To follow Ma'at was to prosper. To embrace Isfet was to invite disaster. The world was fundamentally orderly and just, and human welfare depended on aligning oneself with that order. Yet the Egyptians also recognized that the world did not always operate according to perfect justice. The righteous sometimes suffered while the wicked prospered. Natural disasters struck the innocent. Good kings died young while poor rulers lived long. This apparent contradiction between the ideal of Ma'at and the reality of experience troubled Egyptian thinkers, and some texts, particularly from periods of social upheaval, expressed doubt and questioning about the reliability of cosmic order. But these doubts never fundamentally undermined the concept of Ma'at. Instead, they were incorporated into a more nuanced understanding that recognized that Ma'at operated over the long term, that justice might be delayed but would ultimately prevail, especially in the afterlife, where the wicked would be punished and the righteous rewarded. The judgment of the dead, as we shall see, was fundamentally about Ma'at, about whether the deceased had lived an ordered and just life. As we reflect on Ma'at and Isfet, we see a worldview that understood existence as a dynamic balance between order and chaos, a balance that required constant maintenance through right action and proper ritual. The Egyptians did not believe in a stable, unchanging world but in a cosmos that was continually at risk, continually needing to be defended and renewed. Their religion gave them the tools and the framework to participate in that cosmic project, to align themselves with the forces of order and to push back against the ever-present threat of chaos. Death was not the end for the ancient Egyptians. It was a transformation, a dangerous journey, and a potential gateway to eternal life. The elaborate funerary practices for which ancient Egypt is so famous, from mummification to pyramid construction to the Book of the Dead, all reflected a complex and highly developed set of beliefs about what happened after death. To understand Egyptian religion, we must explore the geography of the afterlife and the trials the deceased faced in their quest for immortality. The Egyptian concept of the person was complex and multifaceted. Unlike the Western binary of body and soul, the Egyptians understood the human being as composed of several distinct but interrelated elements. The Khat was the physical body, the corporeal form that would decay after death unless preserved through mummification. The Ka was a kind of vital force or life energy, represented by upraised arms, that was given to each person at birth and separated from the body at death. The Ba was often translated as soul, but it was more specifically the personality or essential character of the individual, depicted as a bird with a human head. The Ak was the transformed, affective spirit that the deceased hoped to become after successfully navigating the afterlife. The Ren was the name which the Egyptians believed was a fundamental part of a person's being. To erase someone's name was to destroy their existence even in the afterlife. The Shut was the shadow, another essential component of the self. All of these elements needed to be preserved and reunited for the deceased to achieve eternal life. Immediately after death, the Ba separated from the body and began a perilous journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The Duat was not a single place but a complex geography of regions, gates, rivers, and lakes through which the deceased had to travel. It was simultaneously beneath the earth and in the sky, existing in a kind of parallel dimension to the world of the living. The Duat was dark and filled with dangers, populated by demons, serpents, and other hostile entities that sought to prevent the deceased from reaching their destination. The journey through the Duat was guided by funerary texts, collections of spells, incantations, and maps that the deceased would need to navigate the afterlife successfully. The most famous of these texts is the Book of the Dead, though this modern title is misleading. The ancient Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, and it was not a single, fixed text but a collection of spells that could be customized for individual deceased persons. Different versions of the Book of the Dead contain different combinations of spells, depending on what the deceased or their family could afford and what they believed would be most necessary for the journey. The geography of the Duat was complex and varied depending on which texts one consulted. The Book of Gates described the Duat as divided into 12 regions, one for each hour of the night, through which the sun god Ra traveled in his bark. Each region had its own landscape, its own dangers, its own guardian deities. The first hour was a realm of semi-darkness, a transitional space between the world of the living and the full darkness of the underworld. Here, the deceased would board the night bark of Ra, joining the crew for the perilous journey ahead. The second and third hours took Ra through regions inhabited by various deities and spirits, some friendly, some neutral, some hostile. The deceased had to know the names of these beings, had to greet them properly, had to show they possessed the requisite knowledge to pass safely. The Book of the Dead provided the necessary information. O you who appears in the sacred land, whose years are of the time of eternity, if I know your name, you shall not have power over me. Knowledge was protection, ignorance was vulnerability. The fourth and fifth hours brought Ra to the realm of Soker, an ancient god of the dead associated with darkness and the desert. This was a particularly dangerous region, sandy and difficult to navigate, filled with serpents and demons. The sun god's bark had to be towed through this region by deities, as there was no water to float upon. The deceased accompanying Ra had to be vigilant, had to recite protective spells, had to maintain awareness even in this place of profound darkness. The sixth hour, the deepest point of the night, was the location of the judgment of the dead in some texts. Here, in the Hall of Two Truths, Osiris sat enthroned, and the weighing of the heart took place. This was the crisis point of the journey, the moment when the deceased's entire life would be evaluated, when their moral worth would be measured against the feather of Mot. Success meant continuation of the journey and ultimate rebirth. Failure meant annihilation by Ammit, the devourer. The 7th through 11th hours represented the gradual return to life, the movement back toward the light. But these hours were not simply a reversal of the earlier journey. They had their own challenges, their own gatekeepers who had to be convinced or compelled to allow passage. The deceased had to demonstrate that they had been transformed by their journey through death, that they had acquired new knowledge and power, that they were worthy to emerge again into the light of day. These spells served multiple functions. Some were protective, warding off the demons and dangers of the Duat. Others were transformative, allowing the deceased to change form, becoming a lotus flower, a heron, a phoenix, or other sacred creatures. Some were knowledge-based, providing the names of the guardians of gates or the passwords needed to pass through different regions. Still others were ethical declarations, asserting the deceased's righteousness and worthiness to enter the afterlife. The ultimate destination of the deceased was the Hall of Two Truths, where the judgment of the dead would take place. This judgment scene, depicted in countless papyri and tomb paintings, was one of the most important moments in the afterlife journey. The deceased would stand before Osiris, the god of the dead, who sat enthroned as judge. Surrounding Osiris were 42 divine judges, each representing a different nome or district of Egypt, each responsible for judging a particular sin. The judgment itself involved the weighing of the heart. The deceased's heart, understood as the seat of thought, emotion and moral character, was placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side was placed the feather of Mot, representing truth, justice and cosmic order. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, stood ready to record the result. Ammit, a terrifying composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, waited nearby, ready to devour the hearts of those who failed the judgment. Before the weighing, the deceased had to recite the negative confession, a long declaration of sins not committed. "I have not killed," the deceased would declare. "I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not committed adultery. I have not defrauded the temple offerings. I have not added to the weight of the balance. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children." On and on the confession went, covering every imaginable moral failing, each declaration made to a different divine judge. If the heart balanced perfectly with the feather of Mot, the deceased was declared Masaikaru, meaning true of voice or justified. This meant that the deceased had lived according to Mot, had upheld truth and justice, and was worthy to enter the afterlife. Osiris would welcome them, and they would proceed to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, where they would enjoy eternal life in a perfected version of Egypt. But if the heart was heavy with sin, weighed down by falsehood, injustice and violation of Mot, it would tip the scales. In that terrible moment, Ammit would devour the heart, and the deceased would suffer the second death, complete annihilation, ceasing to exist even as a spirit. This was the fate most feared by the ancient Egyptians, worse than any torture or punishment, because it meant total obliteration, the extinction of the self, the erasure of their name from existence. The field of reeds, called Aru in Egyptian, was the destination for those who passed the judgment. It was imagined as an idealized Egypt, with abundant crops, perfect weather and no toil or suffering. The deceased would own fields and gardens, would enjoy the company of the gods and their loved ones who had also achieved justified status. They would participate in the daily journey of Ra across the sky, joining the crew of the solar bark in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. But even in paradise, the deceased had responsibilities. The fields needed to be plowed and harvested, irrigation ditches needed to be maintained. To avoid this labor, the wealthy would be buried with Shakti figures, small mummy-formed statues inscribed with spells that would animate them in the afterlife to perform work on behalf of the deceased. Some tombs contained hundreds of Shaptis, one for each day of the year, plus overseer Shaptis to direct the workers. The journey through the duat and the judgment scene reflected the Egyptian understanding that the afterlife had to be earned. Unlike some religious traditions where salvation is granted by divine grace or faith, the Egyptian afterlife was based on moral conduct and ritual knowledge. The deceased had to have lived according to Mot, and they had to know the proper spells and passwords to navigate the dangers of the duat. Both ethics and knowledge were necessary for eternal life. This created a kind of meritocracy of the afterlife, though one complicated by wealth. The poor could not afford elaborate tombs, expensive funerary texts, or professional embalmers. Their chances of achieving eternal life were correspondingly reduced, not because they were less moral but because they lacked the resources to properly prepare for the journey. By the later periods of Egyptian history, some texts suggest a growing concern with this inequality, with spells and rituals being developed that could be performed more cheaply, making the afterlife more accessible to ordinary people. The concept of transformation was central to the afterlife journey. The deceased hoped to become an Ak, a transfigured spirit with power and effectiveness in both the realm of the dead and the world of the living. The Ak could move freely between worlds, could receive offerings from the living and in turn could intervene to help or harm their descendants. This is why maintaining the tomb and making regular offerings was so important. The living fed and sustained the dead, and the dead protected and blessed the living. But transformation could take other forms as well. The deceased could become a star, joining the imperishable stars that never set below the horizon, sailing across the night sky for eternity. They could become one with Osiris, participating in his death and resurrection, experiencing the eternal cycle of renewal. They could merge with Ra, joining the sun god's daily journey across the sky and through the duat. These different afterlife destinies were not mutually exclusive but could be understood as different aspects or phases of the deceased's eternal existence. The solar afterlife became increasingly important in later periods, especially during the New Kingdom. The deceased hoped to join Ra's crew on the solar bark, defending the sun against Apophis and participating in the daily triumph of light over darkness. This solar theology emphasized action and struggle rather than the peaceful agriculture of the field of reeds. The deceased became a cosmic warrior, an active participant in the maintenance of Mot against the forces of Isfet. Women's afterlife experiences were generally understood to parallel those of men, though with some differences in emphasis. Women could become transfigured ox, could pass the judgment of the heart, could enter the field of reeds. Queens and elite women had elaborate tombs and funerary equipment comparable to those of men of similar status. However, some spells and transformations were gender-specific, and the iconography of the afterlife often reflected the gendered division of labor in Egyptian society. The relationship between the living and the dead was ongoing and reciprocal. The living had obligations to the dead, to maintain the tomb, to make offerings of food, drink, and incense, to speak the name of the deceased to keep their memory alive. In return, the dead had power to help or harm the living. Letters to the dead survive from ancient Egypt, written by living people asking their deceased relatives to intervene with the gods on their behalf, to protect them from enemies, to send children, to cure illness. This meant that death did not sever family relationships but transformed them. The ancestors remained part of the family, present though invisible, powerful though bodiless. The tomb was the interface between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the place where offerings could be made, where prayers could be heard, where communication between the realms was possible. As we contemplate the Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife, we see a civilization that refused to accept mortality as final. Through mummification, through funerary ritual, through moral living and ritual knowledge, the Egyptians believed they could defeat death, could transform it from an ending into a transition, could achieve eternal life in the company of the gods. This belief shaped their entire civilization, motivating the construction of monuments that have lasted thousands of years, preserving texts that allow us to understand their hopes and fears, their moral values and cosmic vision. Magic was not separate from religion in ancient Egypt but was woven into every aspect of religious belief and practice. The Egyptians called this power Heka, and it was understood as a fundamental force of the universe, present at creation, wielded by the gods and accessible to humans through proper knowledge and technique. To understand Egyptian religion without understanding Heka would be to miss a crucial dimension of how the Egyptians interacted with the divine and sought to influence the world around them. Heka was personified as a god, depicted as a man holding two intertwined serpents, but Heka was also the force this god embodied. In the creation myths, Heka was present at the beginning, one of the powers the creator god used to bring the world into being. The coffin texts, funerary literature from the Middle Kingdom, state that the creator god fashioned Heka before creating anything else, using it as the instrument of creation. This meant that Heka was not merely a tool or technique but a cosmic force as fundamental as light or darkness, order or chaos. The word Heka itself is sometimes translated as magic, but this translation can be misleading because it imports our modern distinction between magic and religion, a distinction the ancient Egyptians would not have recognized. Heka was the activating power that made ritual effective, that allowed words and actions to influence both the material and spiritual worlds. Every priest who performed a temple ritual, every doctor who recited a healing spell, every person who wore an amulet for protection, was utilizing Heka. The gods themselves used Heka constantly. Isis was renowned as the greatest of magicians, and myths tell of how she used Heka to heal Horus when he was stung by a scorpion, how she discovered Ra's secret name and thereby gained power over him, how she resurrected Osiris through magical incantations. Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, was also a master of Heka, using it to mediate disputes among the gods, to heal the wounded eye of Horus, to maintain cosmic order. Even Ra wielded Heka in his nightly battle against Apophis, using magical spells and gestures to bind and defeat the serpent of chaos. If the gods used Heka, then humans could too, provided they had the necessary knowledge. This knowledge was both practical and linguistic. Effective magic required knowing the proper words, gestures, and materials, and combining them in the correct way. The words were crucial because the Egyptians believed that language had creative power, that to name something was to have power over it, that properly formulated speech could compel reality to conform to the speaker's will. This belief in the power of words extended to writing. Hieroglyphs were not merely a system for recording speech but were themselves magical objects. Each hieroglyph was a little image, and images had power. This is why in tomb inscriptions, dangerous animals like snakes and crocodiles were sometimes depicted incomplete, missing their tails or with knives through their bodies, to prevent them from coming to life and harming the tomb owner. Writing a person's name could affect them for good or ill. Erasing a name from a monument was an act of magical destruction. The most extensive collection of magical texts that survive from ancient Egypt are the funerary spells found in pyramids, coffins, and papyri. The pyramid texts, carved on the walls of Old Kingdom pyramids, contain some of the oldest religious writings in the world, spells designed to help the deceased pharaoh ascend to the sky and join the imperishable stars. These spells use powerful, sometimes violent language, describing the pharaoh as a fierce bull who devours the gods to absorb their power, or as a magical serpent who cannot be bound or killed. The coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom democratized these spells somewhat, making them available to non-royal persons who could afford decorated coffins. The Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom expanded this democratization further, with papyrus copies available to anyone who could pay for them. All of these texts were essentially collections of magical spells, designed to protect the deceased, to help them navigate the Duat, to provide them with the knowledge they needed to pass through gates and overcome obstacles, to ensure they would be declared justified in the judgment of the dead. But magical practice was not limited to funerary contexts. The Egyptians used Heka in daily life for protection, healing, love, success, and harm. Protective amulets were worn by living people to ward off disease, injury, and malevolent spirits. The Eye of Horus amulet, representing the restored eye of the god, was particularly popular, believed to convey health and wholeness. The Ankh symbol, representing life, was commonly worn as an amulet. Scarabs, representations of the dung beetle sacred to the sun god, were believed to convey rebirth and renewal. Each amulet had its own specific powers and uses. The Tayat or Isis knot amulet, shaped like an ankh with the arms bent downward, was believed to provide the protection of Isis, particularly for women in childbirth. The Jed pillar amulet, representing the backbone of Osiris, conveyed stability and endurance. The Uriah serpent amulet provided royal protection, as the cobra was understood to be a manifestation of the Eye of Ra, the fierce destructive power that defended the sun god and, by extension, the pharaoh. Amulets were not simply decorative objects that one wore and forgot about. They had to be activated through ritual to become effective. The Book of the Dead contains detailed instructions for creating and consecrating amulets. The Tayat amulet, for instance, had to be made from red jasper, dipped in water in which ankh flowers had been steeped, and recited over with a specific spell. Only then would it provide effective protection. The material, the color, the ritual actions, and the words of power all had to combine correctly for the magic to work. The practice of Heka extended into the realm of medicine in profound ways. Ancient Egyptian physicians were also magicians, understanding that illness had both physical and spiritual dimensions. A broken bone might be set and splinted using purely practical techniques, but the treatment would also include spells to drive away the demons of pain and to invoke healing deities. The magico-medical papyri that survive show this integration clearly, with prescriptions for herbal remedies appearing side by side with incantations and ritual instructions. Consider a spell for headache from the Ebers Papyrus. Come to me, remedy. Come to me, you who drive out evil things in this my stomach, who drive out evil things in these my limbs. The patient would recite this while applying a poultice of specific herbs. The spell was not separate from the medicine but was part of the medicine, addressing the spiritual cause of the illness while the herbs addressed the physical symptoms. Both were necessary for complete healing. Love magic was particularly popular, judging from the number of love spells that survive. These spells attempted to inflame the desired person with uncontrollable passion for the spellcaster. They often invoked Hathor, the goddess of love, but could also call upon more dangerous deities. One spell instructs the practitioner to obtain a fish, write the names of the practitioner and the desired person on the fish in ink made from a specific recipe, then release the fish back into the Nile, creating a sympathetic connection that would draw the two people together as surely as the fish was drawn to water. Protective magic for the home and family was constant and essential. Houses had magical inscriptions on their doorframes and thresholds. Special wands, often made from hippopotamus ivory and carved with protective deities and demons, were used to draw magical circles around sleeping children to keep harmful spirits away. These wands, called apotropaic wands, show a fascinating array of protective beings. The dwarf god Bes, fierce lions, serpents, scorpions depicted in non-threatening poses, all martial to defend the vulnerable sleeper. Healing was a domain where magic and medicine were completely intertwined. Egyptian medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus or the Edwin Smith Papyrus, combine empirical observations and practical treatments with magical spells and incantations. A doctor treating a wound might clean it, apply medicinal herbs, and recite a spell invoking Isis or Thoth to enhance the healing. The spell was not considered less important than the physical treatment. Both were necessary for effective healing. Some magical practices were designed to compel the gods themselves. Love spells survive that invoke deities like Hathor or Isis to make a desired person fall in love with the spellcaster. Curse tablets exist that call upon gods to punish enemies or rivals. These practices walked a dangerous line because compelling a god could be seen as a violation of proper cosmic hierarchy, but the texts suggest it was done nonetheless, especially in private, non-official contexts. The gods could be manipulated through Heka because they, like everything else in the universe, were subject to cosmic laws and principles. A spell that invoked the proper names and symbols, that recited the correct mythological precedents, that aligned itself with Ma'at, could compel even a powerful deity to act. This was especially true if the spell invoked sympathetic magic, creating a symbolic connection between the magician's actions and the desired result. Sympathetic magic operated on the principle that effects like, to harm an enemy, one might create a wax or clay figurine representing that enemy, then burn it, break it, or bury it, believing that what happened to the figurine would happen to the person it represented. To ensure a successful childbirth, one might recite the myth of the birth of Horus, creating a symbolic connection between the divine birth and the human one. To protect a house, one might draw magical symbols on the walls or bury protective amulets at the threshold. The spoken word in magical practice was paramount. To recite a spell was to activate the power contained in its words. This is why many magical texts include the instruction that the spell must be recited correctly, with the proper intonation and emphasis. A mispronounced spell might be ineffective or even dangerous, turning the power back on the practitioner. The magician had to know not only what to say but how to say it. Magical practice also involved the use of specific materials at specific times. Certain spells had to be performed at sunrise or sunset, at the new moon or the full moon, when certain stars were visible. Certain materials were inherently magical. Pieces of papyrus inscribed with hieroglyphs, certain stones like lapis lazuli or carnelian, metals like gold or copper, plant materials like lotus or acacia, animal parts like crocodile teeth or snake skins. These materials were not merely symbolic but were believed to contain actual power that could be activated through ritual. The professional magician, called a heikau, was a respected figure in Egyptian society. These individuals had specialized knowledge of spells, rituals, and materials. They might be called upon to curse an enemy, to discover a thief, to protect a newborn child, to cure an illness, or to communicate with the dead. Their knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship and through the study of magical texts, some of which were closely guarded secrets. But not all magic was beneficent. The Egyptians recognized the existence of harmful magic, curses and hexes designed to cause injury, illness, or death. Such practices were officially condemned, and the use of harmful magic against another person was considered a serious crime. Texts survive describing trials of individuals accused of using magic to harm the pharaoh or other officials. Yet the very existence of protective spells and amulets suggests that harmful magic was a constant concern. The relationship between Heka and Ma'at was complex. On one hand, magic was a tool for upholding Ma'at, for healing the sick, protecting the vulnerable and maintaining proper order. On the other hand, magic could be used to violate Ma'at, to harm the innocent, to gain unjust advantage, to compel the gods improperly. The ethical dimension of magic depended on how it was used and for what purposes. In temple contexts, Heka was an essential part of the daily ritual. The priest who performed the morning awakening of the god statue was using Heka to animate the divine image, to make it an effective vessel for the god's presence. The recitation of hymns and prayers, the burning of incense, the offering of food, all of these ritual actions were infused with Heka, transforming them from mere physical actions into effective spiritual operations that sustained the gods and, through them, sustained the cosmos. The power of Heka was available to all who had the knowledge to use it, but knowledge was not equally distributed. The wealthy could afford to hire professional magicians, to purchase elaborate amulets and spell papyri, to have their tombs inscribed with powerful magical texts. The poor had to rely on simpler, cheaper forms of magic. Spoken spells passed down orally, crude amulets made from common materials, the intercession of local deities at modest shrines. Yet the fundamental principle remained the same across all social classes. The universe was permeated with Heka, a divine force that could be accessed and directed through proper knowledge and technique. This belief gave the Egyptians a sense of agency in their relationship with the cosmos. They were not merely passive recipients of divine favor or wrath but could actively influence their fate through magical practice, could protect themselves and their loved ones, could communicate with the gods and the dead, could participate in the maintenance of cosmic order. The great stone temples that still stand along the Nile, from Abu Simbel in the south to the Delta in the north, were far more than impressive monuments. They were understood as the actual houses of the gods, places where the divine and human realms intersected, where the gods could be approached, fed, and honored, and where the crucial rituals that sustained the cosmos were performed daily. To understand Egyptian religion, we must enter these temples and explore the elaborate practices and beliefs that structured temple life. The temple was called the Hwt Netjer, the mansion of the god, and this designation was literal. The temple housed the god statue, which was kept in the innermost sanctuary, a dark, intimate space accessible only to the highest-ranking priests and the pharaoh himself. This statue was not merely a representation of the god but was understood to be the god, or at least a vessel through which the god's presence could manifest in the physical world. The cult statue was treated like a living being with needs and desires that had to be satisfied through daily ritual. The architecture of the temple was highly symbolic, designed to represent the cosmos in miniature. The floor gradually rose as one progressed deeper into the temple, while the ceiling lowered, creating an increasingly intimate and sacred space. The floor was often decorated with plants representing the earth, while the ceiling was painted with stars representing the sky. The columns were carved and painted to resemble papyrus or lotus plants, transforming the temple hall into a symbolic marsh, the place of creation. These architectural choices were not arbitrary aesthetic decisions but were laden with cosmological meaning. The columns carved to resemble papyrus bundles recalled the marshes of the delta where Isis hid the infant Horus, where creation emerged from watery chaos, where life renewed itself in the tangle of reeds and stems. The lotus columns evoked the lotus flower from which the sun god emerged at creation, the flower that closed at night and opened at dawn, participating in the daily cycle of death and rebirth. To walk through a temple hall supported by these columns was to walk through the landscape of creation itself. The ceiling's decoration was equally significant. Stars were not randomly scattered but were arranged to show actual constellations, with particular attention to the decan stars used to mark the hours of the night and the months of the year. Some temple ceilings show the figure of Nut, the sky goddess, arching over the space, her body spangled with stars, her mouth in the west ready to swallow the sun at evening, her birth canal in the east ready to release the sun at morning. To look up at such a ceiling was to see the cosmos itself, to be reminded that the temple existed not just in Egypt but in the universe, that the rituals performed here connected to the largest patterns and processes of existence. The walls of the temple were covered with reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions, transforming them into enormous books that recorded mythological narratives, ritual procedures, astronomical data, and theological teachings. These were not simply decorations to be admired but were functional texts, meant to be read by priests and to be read by the gods themselves, who would see themselves honored and their myths preserved in stone. The very act of carving these texts was itself a ritual act, one that created a permanent record, that ensured these truths would endure as long as the stones themselves endured. The progression of spaces within the temple reflected degrees of sacredness and purity. The outer courtyard was the most accessible, open to daylight, where ordinary people could come on festival days. Moving inward, one entered the hypostyle hall, a forest of columns supporting a roof, with clerestory windows allowing shafts of light to penetrate the dimness. This hall was accessible only to priests and officials, those who had undergone purification rituals. Beyond this was the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, a small dark chamber where the god's cult statue resided, accessible only to the high priest and the pharaoh, the most purified and most sacred individuals. This spatial hierarchy enacted the Egyptian understanding that the divine presence was not evenly distributed but concentrated, that approaching the gods required increasing levels of purity and authorization, that the most sacred truths were not for public consumption but were mysteries to be guarded and revealed only to the properly initiated. The temple architecture thus created a physical manifestation of theological principles, turning abstract ideas about sacredness, purity, and access to the divine into concrete spatial arrangements through which those ideas could be experienced bodily. The temple was oriented according to cosmic principles, often aligned with the sun's path or with particular stars. The axis of the temple would lead from the bright, public outer areas through progressively darker and more restricted spaces until reaching the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the god resided in darkness. This progression from light to dark, from public to private, from chaos to order, reflected the Egyptian understanding of sacred space as a gradation of holiness. Access to the temple was strictly controlled and hierarchical. The outer courtyards were accessible to ordinary Egyptians on festival days, where they could make offerings and petition the god. But only priests could enter the inner halls, and only the highest-ranking priests and the pharaoh could enter the sanctuary itself. This hierarchy reflected the cosmic hierarchy, with the pharaoh as the supreme intermediary between the human and divine realms, and the priesthood as his delegates in the performance of temple ritual. The priesthood was a complex institution with multiple ranks and specializations. At the top were the high priests, called the Hemnetjer Tipi or first servant of the god, who oversaw the temple and its extensive estates. Below them were various ranks of priests, each with specific ritual responsibilities. The Wab priests performed purification rituals. The lector priests recited the sacred texts. The Sem priests, wearing distinctive leopard skin garments, performed specific ritual roles and ceremonies. Women could serve as priestesses, particularly in the cults of goddesses like Hathor or Neith, though their roles were generally distinct from those of male priests. The most important ritual performed in the temple was the daily service to the god statue. This ritual was performed 3 times a day, at dawn, noon and sunset, though the morning ritual was the most elaborate. The high priest, or in theory the pharaoh himself, would approach the sanctuary in a state of ritual purity, having bathed, shaved his entire body and put on clean linen garments. He would break the clay seal on the sanctuary door, a seal that was renewed each day, and open the doors while reciting hymns. Inside the sanctuary, the priest would approach the naos, the shrine containing the statue. He would open the shrine, revealing the god's image, and would prostrate himself before it, expressing reverence and awe. Then he would proceed to wake the god, treating the statue like a human awakening from sleep. He would clean the statue with water and natron salt, anoint it with sacred oils, dress it in fresh linen garments and adorn it with jewelry and regalia. All of this was done while reciting appropriate spells and prayers. After the god was properly dressed and adorned, the priest would offer food and drink. Bread, beer, meat, vegetables, fruits, all the sustenance a living being would need. These offerings were piled before the statue on offering tables while the priest recited the ritual formulae that magically transferred the essence of the food to the god. The physical food itself would later be distributed to the priests, who consumed it after the god had taken its spiritual essence. This system allowed the extensive temple estates to support large priestly communities while maintaining the fiction that all the food was for the god alone. After the offerings were made, the sanctuary would be sealed again, the priest walking backwards out of the presence of the god, sweeping away his footprints with a broom so that no trace of human intrusion remained. The clay seal would be renewed, and the god would be left in sacred solitude until the next ritual service. This daily routine was understood as essential to maintaining cosmic order. The god, properly fed and honored, would continue to perform his or her cosmic function, whether that was making the sun rise, bringing the Nile flood, maintaining fertility, or defending against chaos. But temple life was not only about daily ritual. Festivals punctuated the calendar, bringing color, music and public participation to religious life. The most important festivals involved processions, when the god's statue would be removed from the sanctuary, placed in a portable shrine or bark, and carried by priests through the temple and sometimes through the surrounding town. The statue was hidden from view within the shrine, but the people could see the bark passing, could make offerings, could shout acclamations and prayers. The Opet festival at Thebes was one of the grandest of these celebrations. During this festival, the statues of Ammonius, Mut and Khonsu were carried in elaborate barks from the great temple complex at Karnak to the temple at Luxor, a journey of about 2 miles. The procession could take weeks, with stops at stations along the way where offerings were made and rituals performed. The festival celebrated the annual renewal of the pharaoh's divine power, connecting him to Ammonius and reaffirming his legitimacy as ruler. Other festivals marked the agricultural cycle, the solar cycle, or important mythological events. The beautiful festival of the valley at Thebes was a time when the living visited the tombs of their ancestors, making offerings and feasting with the dead. The said festival, though not annual, was one of the most important royal festivals, marking 30 years of a pharaoh's reign and ritually renewing his power and vitality. During these festivals, oracles might be consulted. The god statue, carried on the shoulders of priests, could indicate yes or no to questions posed by petitioners through the movement of the bark. If the bark moved forward, the answer was yes. If it became heavy and the priests were forced to set it down, the answer was no. These oracles were used to settle legal disputes, to make important decisions, to discover the will of the gods on matters both personal and political. The temple was also an economic institution of enormous importance. Each major temple controlled vast estates, agricultural lands, workshops, mines and other resources. The temple of Ammonius at Karnak, at the height of its power during the New Kingdom, owned more land than the pharaoh himself and employed tens of thousands of people. The temple estates produced not only the food and materials needed for daily offerings but also surplus that could be traded, creating temple wealth that sometimes rivaled or exceeded that of the state. This economic power gave the priesthood significant political influence. The high priest of Ammonius at Thebes was one of the most powerful individuals in Egypt, sometimes rivaling the pharaoh in authority. During the Third Intermediate Period, the high priests of Ammonius actually ruled southern Egypt as virtual kings, while the pharaohs controlled only the north. This demonstrates how intertwined religion and politics were in ancient Egypt, how the temple was not merely a religious institution but a political and economic power center. The temple also served as a center of learning and culture. Temples housed libraries containing religious texts, medical treatises, astronomical observations, and administrative records. The priests were among the most educated members of society, literate in hieroglyphs and the hieratic script used for everyday writing. The temple schools trained new generations of priests and scribes, preserving and transmitting knowledge across centuries. Astronomical observation was particularly important for temple function. The priests needed to determine the proper times for rituals and festivals, to track the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars, to predict the Nile flood. The temple ceiling of Dendera, for example, contains one of the most complete ancient Egyptian astronomical charts, showing the positions of stars and constellations. This astronomical knowledge was sacred knowledge, part of the secret wisdom through which the priests maintained cosmic order. The temple was also a place of justice and asylum. Petitioners could bring disputes before the god's oracle for resolution. Criminals or accused persons could seek sanctuary in the temple, under the protection of the god. Legal documents were sometimes deposited in temples for safekeeping, under divine guarantee of their validity. The temple thus served multiple social functions beyond the purely religious. The relationship between the temple and the broader community was complex. On one hand, the temple was exclusive, with access restricted by purity requirements and hierarchical rank. On the other hand, the temple served the community through its festivals, its oracles, its economic activities, and its role in maintaining cosmic order for the benefit of all. The ordinary Egyptian might never enter the inner sanctum of the temple, but they understood that the rituals performed there sustained the world they lived in. Women's participation in temple life varied depending on the deity and the period. Some temples employed women as singers and musicians, performing during rituals and festivals. The god's wife of Ammonius was a powerful religious position held by royal women, especially during the Third Intermediate Period and Late Period, wielding significant authority and wealth. Women could also be priestesses, particularly in goddess cults, though their ritual roles were often distinct from those of male priests. As we contemplate temple life, we see an institution that was simultaneously religious, political, economic, and cultural. The temple was the axis mundi, the center of the world, the place where heaven and earth met, where the gods could be approached, fed, and honored, where the rituals that sustained the cosmos were performed with precision and reverence. The great stone temples that survive today are remnants of a living religious system that operated continuously for thousands of years, maintaining traditions, adapting to changes, preserving knowledge, and serving as the beating heart of Egyptian civilization. The story of ancient Egyptian religion did not end with the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, nor with the suicide of Cleopatra and the Roman annexation in 30 BCE. For several more centuries, the ancient gods continued to be worshipped, temples continued to function, and priests continued to perform the daily rituals that had been performed for millennia. But the traditional religion was entering its final phase, a period of gradual transformation and eventual decline that would take another 700 years to fully unfold. When Alexander conquered Egypt, he was proclaimed pharaoh and portrayed himself as the legitimate successor to the native Egyptian kings. He made offerings to the Egyptian gods, consulted the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis, and presented himself as the son of Ammonius. After Alexander's death, Egypt fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies, though Greek in language and culture, understood that to rule Egypt effectively, they had to accommodate and appropriate the traditional religious system. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs in the Egyptian style, commissioning temples decorated with reliefs showing them making offerings to the traditional gods. Some of the best preserved Egyptian temples, including Edfu, Dendera, and Philae, were built or extensively renovated during the Ptolemaic period. These temples followed traditional architectural plans and were decorated with traditional iconography and hieroglyphic inscriptions. To the casual observer, a Ptolemaic temple looked much like a New Kingdom temple, suggesting continuity rather than change. But beneath this surface continuity, significant transformations were occurring. The Ptolemies introduced Greek administrative systems and settled Greek colonists throughout Egypt. A bilingual culture emerged, with Greek spoken in the cities and Egyptian in the countryside, Greek used for administration and Egyptian used for religion. The priesthood had to navigate between two worlds, maintaining traditional rituals while also dealing with Greek-speaking rulers and administrators. One of the most significant religious innovations of the Ptolemaic period was the creation of Serapis, a new god designed to bridge Egyptian and Greek religious traditions. Serapis combined aspects of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with attributes of Greek gods like Zeus, Dionysus, and Hades. He was depicted in Greek style with curly hair and beard, but his cult incorporated Egyptian elements. The Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis in Alexandria, became one of the most important religious centers of the Hellenistic world, attracting worshippers from across the Mediterranean. Isis also underwent a transformation during this period. Her cult spread beyond Egypt, becoming one of the most popular religions in the Greco-Roman world. Temples to Isis were built in Greece, Rome, and throughout the Mediterranean basin. But the Isis worshipped in these foreign temples was a somewhat different goddess than the traditional Egyptian Isis. She absorbed characteristics of Greek goddesses like Demeter and Aphrodite, became a universal mother goddess and protector of sailors, and was worshipped in ways that blended Egyptian and Greek ritual elements. The appeal of Isis to non-Egyptians was multifaceted. She was a powerful female deity in religious systems that were often male-dominated. Her mythology emphasized themes that resonated across cultures: love, loyalty, grief, magical power, and maternal devotion. The story of how she searched for Osiris's body, how she used her magic to resurrect him, how she protected the infant Horus from his enemies, all of these narratives struck deep emotional chords with worshippers regardless of their cultural background. The mysteries of Isis, secret initiation rites that gradually revealed deeper levels of theological knowledge, became particularly popular in the Roman Empire. The Roman writer Apuleius, in his novel The Golden Ass, describes an initiation into the Isis mysteries. Though he does not reveal the actual secrets of the initiation, he conveys the profound emotional and spiritual impact it had on the protagonist, who experienced a kind of death and rebirth, who saw the gods face to face, who was transformed by his encounter with divine power. The temples of Isis in Rome were substantial and well-attended, drawing worshippers from all social classes. Isis was invoked for protection at sea, for success in love, for healing from illness, for guidance in dreams. Her festivals were public celebrations involving processions, music, and ritual drama reenacting the myth of Osiris's death and resurrection. The priests and priestesses of Isis, wearing distinctive linen garments and carrying sacred symbols, became familiar figures in Rome and other Mediterranean cities. But this spread of Egyptian religion beyond Egypt also meant its transformation. The Isis worshipped in Rome was understood through Greek and Roman cultural categories, was associated with Greek and Roman deities, was adapted to serve the needs and expectations of worshippers who had no connection to the Nile Valley. Egyptian religion was becoming part of a larger Mediterranean religious world, losing some of its distinctively Egyptian character even as it gained new adherents. This spread of Egyptian cults into the Greco-Roman world represented both the vitality and the transformation of Egyptian religion. The gods were finding new worshippers, but in the process, they were being reinterpreted, their mythology adapted, their rituals modified to suit non-Egyptian sensibilities. The religious synthesis that characterized the Hellenistic period created new forms of religion that were neither purely Egyptian nor purely Greek but hybrid creations that drew from multiple traditions. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, making it a province of the Roman Empire, the process of transformation accelerated. The Roman emperors, like the Ptolemies before them, presented themselves as pharaohs and commissioned temples in traditional Egyptian style. The Temple of Dendera, with its famous zodiac ceiling, was completed during the Roman period. But Roman Egypt was administered very differently than Ptolemaic Egypt, with more direct imperial control and less accommodation of native traditions. The spread of Christianity posed the greatest challenge to traditional Egyptian religion. Christianity arrived in Egypt early, according to tradition brought by St. Mark in the 1st century CE. The new religion spread rapidly, particularly in the cities, appealing to those who were dissatisfied with the traditional cults or who were seeking a more personal, egalitarian form of religion. By the 3rd century CE, Egypt had a substantial Christian population, and by the 4th century Christianity was becoming the dominant religion. The conflict between Christianity and traditional Egyptian religion was both theological and social. Christians rejected the polytheism of the traditional religion, considering the Egyptian gods to be demons. They denounced the elaborate temple rituals as idolatry, the priesthood as corrupt, and the traditional beliefs about the afterlife as false. As Christianity gained power, especially after the conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, pressure on traditional religion increased. The reign of Emperor Theodosius I marked a turning point. In 391 CE, Theodosius issued edicts banning pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire. In Alexandria, Christian mobs attacked and destroyed the Serapeum, one of the last great pagan temples still functioning. The destruction of the Serapeum was symbolic as well as physical, representing the triumph of Christianity over the old gods. The great library housed in the Serapeum was lost, along with countless ancient texts. Other temples were closed, converted into churches, or destroyed. The priesthood was disbanded, the temple estates confiscated, the daily rituals ceased. Some temples in remote areas continued to function for a time. The Temple of Isis at Philae, on an island in the Nile near Aswan, remained active until 537 CE, when it was finally closed by order of Emperor Justinian. With the closing of Philae, the last flame of ancient Egyptian religion was officially extinguished. The ancient rituals that had been performed continuously for over 3,000 years came to an end. But religious traditions do not disappear overnight. Even as the temples closed and Christianity became dominant, elements of the old religion persisted. The Coptic Christians of Egypt, the descendants of the ancient Egyptians, retained aspects of their ancestral culture. The Coptic language was descended from ancient Egyptian, written in a modified Greek alphabet. Some Coptic religious practices, such as the veneration of saints and the use of icons, may have been influenced by traditional Egyptian practices of venerating gods and using divine images. Egyptian magical practices also persisted, often adapted and Christianized. Coptic magical texts survive that invoke Christian saints and angels but use techniques and formulas descended from ancient Egyptian magic. Amulets and protective spells continue to be used, now invoking Christ and Mary instead of Isis and Horus, but serving the same protective functions they had served for millennia. When the Arab-Muslim conquest brought Islam to Egypt in the 7th century CE, the transformation of Egypt's religious landscape continued. Christianity remained the religion of the majority for several more centuries, but gradually, over time, most Egyptians converted to Islam. The process was gradual and complex, driven by economic incentives, social pressure, and the appeal of the conquering religion. By the time of the Crusades, Egypt was a predominantly Muslim country, though with a substantial Christian minority. The Islamic period saw the final erasure of ancient Egyptian religion from living practice, but also, paradoxically, the beginning of renewed interest in the ancient past. Medieval Muslim scholars like al-Masudi wrote about the pyramids and temples, trying to understand the civilization that had built them. The hieroglyphs could no longer be read, and the temples were silent, but the monuments remained, inspiring wonder and speculation about the ancient past. The European rediscovery of ancient Egypt began in earnest with Napoleon's invasion in 1798. Napoleon brought with him a team of scholars who systematically documented the monuments and collected artifacts. The publication of their findings in the Description de l'Egypte sparked Egyptomania across Europe, a fascination with ancient Egyptian art, architecture, and culture that continues to this day. The decipherment of hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, building on the Rosetta Stone, was a breakthrough that finally allowed modern scholars to read ancient Egyptian texts directly. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the voices of the ancient Egyptians could be heard again, their myths and rituals understood, their beliefs and practices studied and appreciated. Modern Egyptology has revealed the extraordinary sophistication and longevity of ancient Egyptian religion. We can now read the pyramid texts carved in Old Kingdom pyramids, the hymns inscribed on temple walls, the spells written on papyri, the letters to the dead scratched on potsherds. We can understand the complex theological systems, the mythological narratives, the ritual practices that structured Egyptian life for 3 millennia. But this understanding is academic and historical, not religious in the living sense. There are no communities today that worship Ra or Osiris as their gods, no priests who wake the statues in the morning and make offerings, no one who expects to be judged by Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths after death. Ancient Egyptian religion, as a living tradition, is extinct. Yet its legacy persists in ways both obvious and subtle. The great monuments, the pyramids and temples and tombs, continue to stand as testament to the civilization's achievements and beliefs. The art and artifacts fill museums around the world, allowing millions of people to encounter ancient Egyptian culture. The hieroglyphs have been deciphered, the texts translated, the myths and rituals documented and studied. Ancient Egyptian religious concepts have also influenced later traditions. The idea of judgment after death, of the heart being weighed against a standard of righteousness, has parallels in other religious traditions. The concept of resurrection and eternal life, though understood differently, became central to Christianity. The image of the Divine Mother nursing her child, depicted in countless statues of Isis nursing Horus, may have influenced Christian iconography of Mary and Jesus. Some modern spiritual movements have sought to revive ancient Egyptian religion, creating neo-pagan practices based on ancient texts and beliefs. These Reconstructionist movements are sincere attempts to connect with the ancient tradition, but they face the fundamental challenge that the living context of ancient Egyptian religion, the culture and worldview that gave it meaning, is lost. What they create is necessarily a modern interpretation, filtered through contemporary concerns and understandings. As we reflect on the transformation and decline of ancient Egyptian religion, we see a tradition that endured for an astonishing span of time, adapting to invasions, foreign rule and cultural change, yet maintaining remarkable continuity across millennia. But no tradition is immortal. The great river of Egyptian belief, which flowed for 3,000 years, eventually ran dry, its waters absorbed into new streams of faith and practice. Yet the channel it carved through history remains, and we can still trace its path, still marvel at its depth, still learn from the civilization that navigated its currents with such skill and devotion. The Nile still flows through Egypt as it has flowed for millions of years, its waters sustaining life in the desert just as they sustained the ancient civilization we have explored tonight. The temples still stand, though silent now, their stones weathered by time, their hieroglyphs waiting to be read by those who know the ancient language. The pyramids still rise against the sky, monuments to beliefs about death and resurrection, order and chaos, the human and the divine. Ancient Egyptian religion was one of humanity's most sustained and sophisticated attempts to understand existence, to explain the origins of the world, to map the geography of the afterlife, to maintain order against chaos, to find meaning in the great cycles of life, death, and rebirth. For 3,000 years, it provided a framework through which millions of people understood their place in the cosmos, their obligations to the gods and to each other, their hopes for eternal life. The longevity of this religious tradition is itself remarkable. 3,000 years is longer than the entire span of Christianity or Islam. It encompasses the rise and fall of countless empires, the invention and abandonment of technologies, the transformation of languages and cultures. Yet throughout this immense period, the fundamental structure of Egyptian religion remained recognizable. The gods might change names or merge with one another, new deities might be introduced and old ones fade, theological emphases might shift, but the basic worldview persisted. The universe as a dynamic balance between order and chaos, maintained through ritual, sustained by Ma'at, threatened by Isfet, populated by gods who walked among humans and intervened in their affairs. This persistence suggests that Egyptian religion successfully addressed fundamental human needs and questions. It provided answers to the mystery of death that offered hope without denying death's reality. It gave people practical tools, through magic and ritual, for addressing life's challenges. It created a sense of cosmic order and meaning that helped people navigate the uncertainties of existence. It connected individuals to their ancestors, their communities, and the land itself through shared beliefs and practices. It transformed the Nile Valley into a sacred landscape where every element had meaning, where geography itself told stories about the gods and about the human journey from birth through death to hoped for rebirth. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself standing once more on the banks of the Nile, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The river flows beside you, eternal and unchanging, carrying with it the whispers of ancient prayers, the echoes of hymns sung in temples now silent, the memories of a civilization that saw the sacred in everything, that refused to accept death as final, that believed through proper knowledge and right action, through ritual and devotion, through the maintenance of Ma'at, humans could participate in the divine project of sustaining creation itself. If you found value in this journey through ancient Egyptian religion, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of history's great civilizations. Your support helps us continue creating these deep dives into the past. Rest well, knowing that you carry with you now a deeper understanding of one of history's most remarkable religious traditions, a tradition that shaped the course of civilization and continues to fascinate and inspire us thousands of years after its final flame was extinguished. May your dreams be peaceful, your sleep restorative, and may you wake renewed, like the sun rising over the Nile, bringing light to a new day.